Everyone expected the next major strike to hit a nuclear site, a missile depot, or a military command center. Instead, according to multiple defense analysts piecing together this week's activity, U.S. forces reportedly hit something almost nobody was watching. And the reason it matters more than any obvious target might is exactly why nobody saw it coming. So let's ask the question that actually matters here. If the real target wasn't the site everyone expected, what does that tell us about which parts of this war actually decide the outcome? Here's what's being reported, cross-referenced across several open-source monitoring accounts tracking activity in the region this week. The strike in question didn't hit a missile silo, a radar installation, or a hardened bunker. It hit a fuel distribution and logistics hub, the kind of facility that rarely makes headlines because, on the surface, it doesn't look like a military target at all. That's exactly the point. According to analysts, studying the decision behind this strike, modern militaries don't run on missiles and munitions alone. They run on fuel, transportation networks, and the unglamorous logistics infrastructure that moves everything else where it needs to go. Take that infrastructure offline, even partially, and an entire military apparatus can grind toward paralysis without a single missile or radar system ever being directly touched. Because that's really the story hiding underneath this week's headlines. Every previous strike we've covered in this conflict has targeted something dramatic. A missile system, a nuclear facility, an underground bunker. This one targeted something almost boring by comparison. And according to the people who actually study how modern militaries function, that's precisely why it might matter more than any of the others. Before we get into exactly why this specific target was chosen, and there's a detail about the timing that should genuinely change how you think about this entire war, hit subscribe and stay with me, because this is the kind of strike that reshapes a conflict quietly, without ever generating the kind of dramatic footage that trends. Here's why fuel and logistics infrastructure matters this much, explained clearly. Every piece of military hardware, from a fighter jet to a supply truck to a mobile missile launcher, depends on a continuous, reliable fuel supply chain to actually operate. Militaries plan around this dependency obsessively, building redundant supply routes and strategic fuel reserves, specifically because commanders understand that a force without fuel is a force that can't move, can't resupply, and can't sustain any operation for very long, regardless of how sophisticated its weapon systems are. That dependency is exactly what makes fuel and logistics infrastructure such an attractive target, even though it rarely generates the kind of dramatic coverage a missile strike does. Destroying a single missile system removes one specific capability. Disrupting the fuel network that supplies dozens of different military functions simultaneously creates a much broader, much harder to reverse operational problem, one that doesn't require guessing which specific weapon system matters most, because it affects nearly everything at once. Here's the detail about timing that should genuinely catch your attention. According to several analysts studying the pattern of strikes throughout this conflict, this specific facility had reportedly been monitored for weeks before this strike occurred, with increased satellite coverage and activity tracking, suggesting it had been identified as a priority target well before this week's action actually took place. That timeline detail matters enormously because it reframes the entire story. This wasn't a target selected reactively in response to some immediate battlefield development. This was, by all appearances, a deliberately chosen target, selected after weeks of sustained observation specifically because of the outsized strategic value it offered, relative to how little public attention it was likely to attract. Think about what that timing actually implies about how modern military planning works. If defense planners spent weeks quietly building the case for targeting a logistics hub over more obvious, more dramatic targets, that suggests a level of strategic patience and prioritization that goes well beyond simply reacting to whatever target looks most impressive in a headline. It suggests a genuine understanding that operational paralysis achieved quietly can be more valuable than destruction achieved dramatically. There's a broader principle worth naming here, one that shows up throughout military history far more consistently than most people realize. Wars are rarely won purely by destroying an adversary's most visible, most impressive assets. They're frequently decided by disrupting the unglamorous infrastructure that makes everything else function. Supply lines, fuel networks, communication relays, logistics hubs. Destroy enough of that connective tissue and even a fully intact, fully armed military can find itself unable to actually project the power its equipment alone would suggest it has. That's genuinely the deeper lesson sitting underneath this specific strike. It's not about how impressive the target looked from the outside. It's about how much of the broader military apparatus quietly depends on infrastructure exactly like this. Infrastructure that almost never appears in headline coverage precisely because it isn't designed to look dramatic, even though its loss can be more strategically consequential than the loss of a single missile system or radar installation. So here's where this actually leaves the broader trajectory of this conflict. If reports about this strike's effectiveness prove accurate, The operational impact likely extends well beyond the immediate facility itself, rippling outward into every part of the military apparatus that depended on it for fuel, resupply, or logistical coordination. That kind of ripple effect doesn't show up cleanly in a single dramatic headline. It shows up gradually in slower response times, disrupted supply chains, and operational friction that compounds over the following weeks. So here's where I land on this. The strikes that generate headlines are the ones with the biggest visible impact, the largest craters, the most dramatic footage, the most obvious military hardware destroyed. But the strikes that actually reshape a conflict's trajectory are frequently the quieter ones, targeting the unglamorous infrastructure that everything else depends on, chosen not because they look impressive, but because they're strategically irreplaceable in ways that aren't immediately obvious from the outside. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the most consequential strikes are often the ones nobody's talking about, how many other quiet and unglamorous targets in this conflict deserve far more attention than they're actually getting? Drop your take in the comments. I want to know what you think the next hidden target might be. And if breakdowns like this, the strikes that actually matter, not just the ones that trend, are what you come here for, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this story still unfolding. Let's go deeper into how a target like this actually gets identified and prioritized in the first place, because the process reveals a lot about how modern military planning has evolved well beyond simply identifying the most visually impressive targets available. Intelligence analysts don't build target priority lists purely based on how destructive a strike would look. They build them based on modeling how disrupting a specific piece of infrastructure ripples outward through an entire military and logistical system. That kind of modeling requires understanding an adversary's entire operational structure in considerable detail, which facilities supply which units, which supply routes feed which forward positions, and which single points of failure, if disrupted, would create the widest possible operational impact relative to the resources required to strike them. That's a fundamentally different analytical exercise than simply identifying the largest, most heavily defended target and planning a strike against it. It's worth explaining why fuel and logistics hubs specifically tend to score so highly in this kind of prioritization modeling. Unlike a single weapon system, which primarily affects one specific capability, a fuel distribution hub often supplies multiple different units, multiple different equipment types, and multiple different operational functions simultaneously. Disrupting it doesn't just remove one tool from an adversary's toolkit. It creates friction across dozens of different operational functions at once, all of which depended on that same underlying resource to keep functioning normally. There's a comparison worth drawing here to how modern supply chain vulnerabilities get identified in civilian contexts, because the underlying logic is remarkably similar. Businesses studying their own supply chain resilience don't just look for their most expensive or most visible assets. They look for single points of failure: the one supplier, the one shipping route, the one piece of infrastructure that, if disrupted, would create cascading problems across multiple other parts of the business simultaneously. Military logistics planning increasingly uses the same kind of systems thinking approach, identifying targets based on cascading operational impact rather than isolated destructive value. It's also worth talking about why this kind of target frequently receives so little public attention compared to more dramatic strikes, even when its strategic impact might be considerably larger. Part of the answer comes down to simple visual storytelling. A missile strike on a clearly military target produces dramatic, easily understood footage, explosions, visible destruction, a clear before and after narrative that fits naturally into news coverage. A strike on a fuel distribution facility, by comparison, often produces far less visually dramatic footage, even when its downstream operational impact is considerably more significant. That gap between visual drama and actual strategic significance creates a genuine distortion in how these conflicts get covered and understood by the public. Viewers and readers naturally gravitate toward the most visually striking stories, which means the quieter, more strategically consequential strikes often receive a fraction of the attention their actual battlefield impact would justify. That's precisely why breakdowns like this one matter, because understanding a conflict accurately requires looking past which stories generate the most dramatic footage and toward which strikes actually reshape the underlying operational reality. There's also a psychological dimension worth exploring here, because targeting logistics and fuel infrastructure has effects that extend beyond pure operational disruption. Military personnel who suddenly find themselves dealing with fuel shortages, delayed resupply, or disrupted logistics chains experience a very different kind of pressure than personnel responding to a direct, visible attack. Operational friction of this kind erodes confidence and morale gradually in ways that are harder to message around publicly than a single dramatic strike, precisely because there's no singular moment to rally around or explain away. That gradual erosion matters strategically in ways that go beyond the immediate physical disruption. A military force experiencing sustained logistics friction has to make harder choices about resource allocation, prioritizing which units and which operations get whatever limited fuel and supplies remain available. Those choices ripple outward into broader strategic decision-making, potentially forcing a scaling back of operations that would otherwise have continued at full intensity if the logistics network had remained fully functional. It's worth talking, too, about how a country facing this kind of disruption typically responds, because the adaptation process reveals a lot about how resilient or fragile the broader military and logistics apparatus actually is. Some responses focus on rapid repair and redundancy, quickly restoring damaged infrastructure or activating backup supply routes that had been built specifically for scenarios like this one. Other responses require more fundamental restructuring, rerouting supply chains through entirely different paths that may be less efficient, but considerably less vulnerable to the specific type of disruption just experienced. How quickly and effectively that adaptation happens says a great deal about the broader resilience of the military apparatus being targeted. A force that can rapidly reroute around a disrupted logistics hub, minimizing the operational impact within days, demonstrates a level of built-in redundancy that suggests considerable prior investment in resilience planning. A force that struggles to adapt, experiencing prolonged operational friction well beyond the immediate aftermath of the strike, suggests underlying vulnerabilities that extend considerably beyond just the specific facility that was targeted. There's a broader strategic question worth raising here too, one that extends past this specific strike and into how this entire conflict might be evolving. If logistics and infrastructure targeting is becoming a more prominent part of the overall strategy, that suggests a shift away from purely destructive, headline-driven strikes and toward a more patient, systems-focused approach aimed at achieving broader strategic paralysis rather than isolated tactical victories. That shift, if it's genuinely underway, would represent a meaningful evolution in how this conflict is actually being fought, separate from whatever the public-facing narrative emphasizes. Wars covered primarily through their most dramatic moments can create a distorted picture of the actual strategic logic driving decision-making behind the scenes. And this specific strike offers a useful window into just how different that underlying logic can be from what gets the most attention in day-to-day coverage. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of how fuel distribution networks function within a modern military, because understanding the underlying infrastructure makes the strategic value of disrupting it considerably clearer. A typical military fuel network isn't a single storage facility. It's a distributed system of storage depots, pipelines or transport routes, and distribution points that feed fuel outward to wherever it's needed, often across considerable distances and multiple different branches of a military simultaneously. That distributed structure exists specifically to build in resilience, similar to the tunnel network redundancy discussed elsewhere in coverage of this conflict. A single storage depot going offline shouldn't, in theory, cripple an entire military's fuel supply, because other depots and alternate routes are supposed to be able to compensate. The question that actually determines a strike's effectiveness isn't whether one facility got hit. It's whether that facility represented enough of the overall network's total capacity or occupied a critical enough position within the broader distribution structure that its loss couldn't be easily compensated for by the rest of the system. That's exactly the kind of analysis defense planners reportedly conducted before selecting this specific target, according to several analysts studying the broader pattern of this conflict's targeting decisions. Not every fuel facility offers the same strategic value if struck. Some represent a small fraction of overall capacity, easily compensated for elsewhere. Others occupy a genuinely critical position within the broader network, supplying a disproportionate share of total capacity or serving as a key node connecting otherwise disconnected parts of the distribution system. It's worth exploring what specifically might have made this particular facility fall into that second, more strategically critical category. Facilities positioned near major transportation junctions, for instance, often serve a coordinating function beyond simple storage, distributing fuel outward across multiple different routes simultaneously. Losing a facility like that doesn't just remove storage capacity. It removes a coordination point that other parts of the network depended on to actually get fuel where it needed to go, even if the fuel itself remained available elsewhere in the broader system. There's also a question worth raising about how sustainable this kind of disruption actually is over time. Because a single successful strike doesn't necessarily create permanent operational damage. Military logistics planners, particularly in a country that has spent decades anticipating exactly this kind of conflict, typically build contingency plans specifically for scenarios where key infrastructure gets disrupted. The real strategic question isn't whether this specific strike caused immediate disruption. It's whether the broader logistics network has enough built-in resilience to fully recover within a time frame that limits the strike's lasting strategic value. That question is genuinely difficult to answer definitively from the outside, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a strike like this one. Full assessment of a logistics disruption's lasting impact typically requires weeks, sometimes longer, of continued monitoring to determine whether alternate routes and backup facilities have successfully compensated, or whether the disruption has created lasting operational friction that continues limiting broader military effectiveness well beyond the initial strike itself. It's worth talking, too, about how this kind of strike fits into a broader historical pattern of infrastructure-focused military strategy, because this approach has deep roots extending well before modern precision weapons made this kind of targeted disruption possible. Strategic bombing campaigns throughout the 20th century increasingly shifted away from purely destructive objectives and toward deliberately targeting fuel production, transportation networks, and industrial capacity specifically because military planners recognized that crippling an adversary's ability to sustain operations often mattered more than destroying any single piece of military hardware. That historical pattern offers useful context for understanding why this specific strike, despite receiving far less attention than more dramatic strikes throughout this conflict, likely represents a continuation of one of the most consistently effective strategic approaches in modern military history, rather than some kind of unusual or secondary tactic. If anything, the sophistication of modern precision targeting makes this kind of infrastructure-focused strategy considerably more effective than it was during earlier eras, when achieving comparable disruption often required far more extensive, far less precise bombing campaigns. There's a comparison worth drawing here between this strike and the broader pattern of infrastructure targeting seen throughout major conflicts of the past century. Earlier strategic bombing campaigns, targeting fuel and industrial infrastructure, often required sustained campaigns involving hundreds or even thousands of aircraft over extended periods to achieve meaningful disruption, given the relative imprecision of the weapons available at the time. Modern precision-guided munitions can potentially achieve comparable strategic disruption through a much smaller number of highly targeted strikes, provided the underlying intelligence work accurately identifies which specific facilities represent genuine critical vulnerabilities within the broader network. That precision represents a genuinely significant evolution in how infrastructure-focused military strategy actually gets executed, separate from the underlying strategic logic itself, which has remained remarkably consistent across nearly a century of modern warfare. The goal hasn't changed. The efficiency with which that goal can now be pursued has changed dramatically. And this specific strike offers a useful, if quietly undercovered, example of that broader technological and strategic evolution playing out in real time. It's also worth considering what this specific strike might reveal about the broader intelligence apparatus supporting this conflict, because accurately identifying critical logistics vulnerabilities requires considerably more detailed operational intelligence than simply locating an adversary's most visible military assets. Understanding which specific facility, out of a distributed, redundant network, represents a genuine critical vulnerability requires detailed knowledge of supply routes, distribution patterns, and operational dependencies that typically takes considerable, sustained intelligence gathering effort to accurately map. That level of detailed operational intelligence suggests a sustained patient intelligence effort, extending well beyond simply identifying obvious military targets from satellite imagery. It suggests analysts studying not just where facilities are located, but how the entire logistics network actually functions as an interconnected system, identifying the specific points where disruption would create the broadest possible operational impact relative to the resources required to achieve it. So here's where all of this actually connects back to the broader arc of this conflict. Every previous strike we've analyzed in this series has focused on destruction. Bigger bombs, deeper penetration, more dramatic footage. This strike represents something genuinely different. A demonstration that disrupting the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure connecting everything else together can achieve strategic effects that rival, and sometimes exceed, what even the most dramatic weapon systems can accomplish on their own. There's a final thought worth leaving you with, because it reframes how you should watch the rest of this conflict unfold from here. The most dramatic strikes will keep generating the most views, the most shares, and the most immediate reaction, simply because that's how visual media works. But if you actually want to understand where this war is heading, the quieter strikes, the ones targeting infrastructure rather than headlines, deserve just as much attention, if not more, because they're frequently the ones actually deciding how much operational capability either side has left to fight with. That's ultimately the insight worth carrying forward from this entire breakdown, extending well beyond this single strike, or even this specific conflict. Modern warfare increasingly rewards patience, systems thinking, and a willingness to target the unglamorous infrastructure that rarely generates headlines, but frequently determines whether a military can actually function at full capacity. The side that understands this distinction and plans accordingly often ends up with a decisive advantage that never shows up clearly in the dramatic footage everyone else is watching. So here's the question I want to leave you with one more time, because it's worth sitting with directly. If the most consequential strikes are often the ones nobody's talking about, how much of this entire conflict's actual trajectory is being decided by stories that never trend at all? Drop your take in the comments. I want to know what you think is happening just outside the headlines. And if breakdowns like this, separating what actually matters from what simply generates the most dramatic footage, are what you come here for, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this conflict's real story still waiting to be uncovered.